Hey friends, welcome back to this series of 20 days of Kronos configuration. Hope you are doing well. Today is day number 7 and we are going to talk about bonuses and deductions. Before we get into the application, I would like to share some information about bonuses and deduction. And prior to that, if you haven't seen the first 6 days of the video tutorial, I'm going to put the link to the playlist in the description. And please do subscribe if you want to learn about Kronos and hit that bell button so that you get notified for my upcoming videos. That being said, let's get started and see what we are going to see in day number 7, which is all about bonuses and deduction rule. What are bonuses and deductions? These are the amounts that are automatically added or deducted from the employee's time card. In the application, when you give a positive amount, that will trigger a pay code which will be treated as bonus, and when you give a negative amount, then the system will treat it as deduction. Now mostly when you are using bonuses and deduction, there are multiple combinations or different ways that you can use bonuses and deductions. Now when you're creating bonus, there can be different triggers that can lead to bonus. When you're creating a deduction rule, the most important thing is the negative amount. This is where the most common mistake that I have seen while setting up the deduction rule is that they ignore or they miss out on giving the deduction amount. So bonuses and deduction are something that gets triggered automatically based on the setup that we do in the system. Any amount that you give in negative will be considered as deduction, and the positive amount will be considered as the bonus. So with that in our mind, let's see how we can set up or create or configure bonus and deduction rule in the application. Let's go straight into the application. Here we are. To access bonuses and deduction, on the setup, expand pay policies, scroll down to your work rule building blocks. In here you have the bonuses and deduction. In the previous session, we've seen auto-resolve exceptions, and prior to that, breaks, core hours exception, shift guarantee, punch round rule, interval round rule, and then we've also seen definitions. Now we are here on bonuses and deduction, so let's go right into it. And I'm going to click on new. So before I do that, before I show you how the bonuses and deduction works, I would like to show you a world without bonuses and deduction, as I always do. So let's go to the time card, and I'm going to give you some couple of scenarios. First will be for deduction, and then we're going to focus then on the bonus. With the same rule, as you can see, it says bonus/deduction. With the same rule, you can create either bonus or deduction. So first I'm going to give you a scenario of how we can use bonus and deduction rule for setting up the deduction. Typically, if you have employees who are salaried, who do not punch in and out for their breaks, they are supposed to take 1 hour of their meal break, but because they do not clock in and out for their meal break, by default we can set up the deduction rule so that 1 hour of meal break can be deducted automatically. So as of now, as I said, there are no rules that are set up or defined in the system. So let's see how the system behaves if I put a punch at 12 and then I leave at 9. So that's my shift. I work from 12 p.m. to 9 p.m. That's a total of 9 hours. However, during my course of the day, I have also taken 1 hour of meal break. However, I do not see that deduction happening because 12 to 9 is 9 hours, and as you can see, the shift and daily shows 9 hours, but there should be a 1 hour of meal break that should be deducted because I'm a salaried employee. I do not clock in and clock out, so I want the system to deduct this 1 hour. That is the whole purpose of what we're going to do now. We're going to make sure that 1 hour of the meal break gets deducted. To do so, we will be using bonus and deduction rule. Now, you now know what is our scenario. We would want 1 hour from here, shift length of 9 hours. We want that 1 hour to be deducted. So it should ideally be 8 hours because the employee has actually taken 1 hour of meal break. but the system doesn't know that the employee's 1 hour should be deducted. So we're going to set up that rule, configure that rule so that the system can deduct 1 hour automatically. So when you open up the bonuses and deduction rule, this is how it looks like. And I'm going to give a name, let's say meal break 1 hour. Now in this bonuses and deduction rule, whether you are going to create a bonus rule or deduction rule, the screen, the look and feel will be the same. However, there are few things that you will set up when you're doing a deduction rule, and when you are doing a bonus rule, I'm going to show you what are the specific things that you need to make a note of. First thing is, if you're creating a meal break, as I said, for 1 hour, in the amount section you need to enter 1. So that means 1 hour of meal break will be deducted. However, if you remember a while ago, while I was showing you what exactly the bonus and deduction rule does, if you give just 1, the system will not understand it is a deduction. So for that reason, you need to enter a -1 or -1, and you can see now that the amount field is now in red. So that means system will consider this as a deduction. And this is the most common mistake that we see often, that we create a deduction rule, but when we go on the time card, we do not see that deduction, because more often than not, we miss out on giving this negative or minus symbol. So that is very important that you give this minus or -1. Or if you are creating, I just gave it as example 1, but if you have 30 minutes deduction, you can give 30 minutes as well. The second thing it says is applies on. That means this 1 hour of meal deduction should happen on which days. So I'm going to say Monday to Friday, and Saturday and Sunday this should not happen. This deduction should not happen because Saturday and Sunday employee is not scheduled to work. So if he comes in work, it should be all amount that he works should be paid to him without any deduction. The other thing that you see here is a trigger, and in this, one of the trigger inside this, you can consider all of these as qualifiers. You can see there is something called as locator here, which is 4 hours. What that means is this 1 hour of deduction should happen when, and the locator is telling the default setting is 4 hours. So that means the 1 hour of meal deduction will take place after 4 hours from the employee's scheduled start time. So the employee is scheduled to work from 12 to 9, and if employee comes at 12 p.m. after 4 hours from 12, that is when the system will record the 1 hour of meal deduction. You can change this, but more often than not, we keep it as the default value, which is 4 hours, because these are typically salaried employees and 1 hour should be deducted automatically. So anytime you can deduct that. So mid, which is the halfway through the shift, which is 4 hours, we typically deduct the 1 hour of meal deduction. Now you also have different qualifiers, which more often than not you may not come across, but I will give you some information about this when I cover the bonus scenario. For now, this is it. This is all that you need to do while you're creating a deduction rule. It is pretty simple. Make sure you give the amount in negative. Select the days when you want this meal break to take place, and the locator will tell you when you want to have this meal break of 1 hour placed in the shift. This is what I have done. I'm going to click on save and return, and this deduction rule now needs to go into the work rule. So I'm going to go into the work rule that is there, which is already assigned to the employee, and now I'm going to bring in that bonus and deduction rule here in this work rule. Here we go. Now just save this, and let's go back to the time card and click on refresh. Okay, I'm going to enter that amount again so that you can see the difference. So the amount earlier, the shift start was 12 till 9 p.m. I'm going to click on calculate totals, and now you can see the shift or the daily and the pay code all have 8 hours. If you remember earlier, without the bonus and deduction rule, it was 9 hours. So that is exactly what the bonus and deduction rule does. It deducts the hour automatically. So employee has punched in on his scheduled time and punched out at his scheduled out time. The system has deducted 1 hour. So that is how you can use a deduction rule. Always remember to put the negative. If you do not give that negative, then you will not give the right output. Now let's take another scenario of the bonus rule. So in this we have both bonuses and deduction. So we've seen how to create the deduction rule. Now we'll see how to create using the bonuses and deduction, how to create a bonus trigger. Let's assume that if an employee is working greater than 10 hours or 11 hours in a day, the employee is supposed to get a meal allowance. So in some company or in some countries, depending on the labor laws, if the employee or the labor is working for more than 10 or 11 hours in a day or in a particular shift, the employee is entitled to pay them or give them a meal allowance. So using the bonus and deduction rule, we can set up the system so that if the employee, for let's say the employee worked till 11 p.m., if you click on the calculate totals, it is almost 10 hours because we also have the deduction rule. So if an employee works for 10 hours in a day, the requirement is the employee should get a meal allowance as well. That's something as per the company policy or as per the labor law. So let's see how we can use the bonus and deduction rule to trigger a meal allowance if an employee is working more than 10 hours in a day. So let's go back to the setup, and in the bonuses and deduction rule, let's click on new, and I'm going to give it as meal allowance, and in the amount we'll click on enter 1. So that means they will get 1 unit of meal allowance. Now the meal allowance is defined in the payroll system. So whenever they work for more than 10 hours in a day, we will generate a unit of meal allowance which we will send to the payroll system, and the payroll system or the payroll vendor will then calculate how much should the dollar value should be. So for 1 unit of meal allowance, they may get X amount of dollar value. So that is something which will be configured or set up in the payroll side. From here we will generate the unit and send it to the payroll vendor. Now let's see how we can create this meal allowance if the employee is working for greater than 10 hours in a day. So we give amount here without any negative, and then it says which days it applies on. I would say it applies on every day. So after giving the amount and the days when this meal allowance should trigger, we'll switch now to the option here which says trigger by. So under this you have 3 options. One is time of the day. Whenever you define time of the day, that would mean on a particular time. So this will not meet our requirement, because our requirement is if the employee works for more than 10 hours in a day, that is when we will pay them 1 unit of meal allowance. So this option trigger by time of the day is not going to work. So I'm going to switch to length of the shift. Now in the length of the shift, as you might have noticed, there are some qualifiers which I have mentioned earlier, like minimum qualifying interval, minimum shift length trigger. We can use this option to generate the meal allowance for our employees. Now here you can see that it says minimum shift length to trigger. I can straight away put the 10-hour window here, and now it says minimum shift length to trigger is 10 hours. So any employee who works less than 10 hours, they are not going to get the meal allowance. Anyone who works greater than 10 hours, that's when their meal allowance is going to get triggered. Okay. And then the other ones, as I said, are triggers or qualifiers. We can use this depending on the different situations. So your client might say that if the employee works more than 10 hours, they should get 1 unit of meal allowance. If they work for less than 10 hours but greater than 7 hours, then there should be another maybe unit of meal allowance that should be triggered, or there should be some other double pay, or there should be some other pay code that should get generated. So you can have multiple bonuses and deduction in the same work rule. Earlier we've seen some of the things like the rounding rule or some other rules that we've set up. You can only have one per work rule, but you can have n number of bonuses and deduction for the same work rule, right? And this bonus and deduction is very useful for meeting the different client requirement. Now I will also give you a quick overview of how you can use the pay code. This is again the most commonly used one, triggered by pay code. However, this requirement that we have wherein employee, if they work for more than 10 hours a day, this can be met by this simple setup where you give minimum shift length to trigger is 10 hours. I'm going to click on save and return. And now let's go into our, so now we have two. One is for the deduction and one is for the bonus. Let's go into our work rule and assign the newly set up meal allowance in the work rule. Right here. There we go. So we've got the bonus rule and the deduction rule right in our work rule. Now I'm going to click on save. Click on save again. And now let's see what happened. Now if you look, the total hours is actually greater than 10 hours for that day, but there is no meal allowance that is generated. Now this is something that I really wanted to show you what happens if you do the setup for bonus and deduction rule. This is one of the common mistakes that happens, that people generally assign the bonus rule or use the bonus and deduction rule, and they give the amount as 1 and they give the shift length or the minimum qualifying interval as whatever the X number of hours, but the meal allowance or the trigger for that pay code doesn't get generated. The reason is that, and if you check, we do have the bonus and deduction rule or the meal allowance bonus and deduction rule already assigned. But this is where you need to go back to your bonuses and deduction rule and check whether you have assigned that pay code or not. If you remember, we've just given the amount and the length of the shift, which is 10 hours. However, the pay code is empty. So here we need to assign the meal allowance pay code which we want the system to generate. So now let's go and save it. And now just hit refresh, and there you see, right? So now you have that meal allowance which is greater than 10 hours, the meal allowance is generated. So if the employee works for less than 10 hours in a day, then the meal allowance should not be generated, right? So however, you can see that the meal allowance is generated because the system is considering anything greater than 10 hours. So let me just put that back. So you can see that the employee is working, the shift total says 10 hours, but the meal allowance is getting still triggered. So that means the system is calculating from 12 till 10, which is 10 hour from a system point of view. So if I change this to, let's say, 8 hours and 59 minutes, or let's say 9 hours and 59 minutes, you can see that the system is now not generating that meal allowance. So because it is not the 10-hour window that we have given. So you need to troubleshoot, you need to play around a bit while you are setting up your bonus rule especially. For that reason, we can also use the other option that we have. Remember I told you there is something called as pay codes. We can also use the pay code trigger to generate the meal allowance. So here we need additional pay code which is coming from your PCD. So if you want to have or use the pay code trigger, then you need to set up in your PCD another pay code. Right here in your PCD, you need to set up another. Right here in the PCD, if you have any pay codes that you've already defined, then you can use the pay code to trigger, and then you can define the amount. So here you can also place the max of 10 hours, minimum 0 to 10. It will generate the meal allowance, but it will use the pay code to trigger from your PCD. So whether it is a regular pay code or whatever pay code that you define, it will use that. As of now, we do not have any pay code to trigger, so I'm just using the length of the shift. But this is another most common one that you will come across when you're using the bonus and deduction rule. So let's go back to the length of the shift, and what we have seen is to create a bonus rule, you can use these qualifiers and then give the amount, and also make sure that you give the pay code here. Otherwise you will not see the pay code when you enter in the time card. Right, so if there is no pay code that is defined, then the pay code will not be generated. So again, to remind you, there are two things that we can do with bonus and deduction rule. One is we can create our deduction rule, and the important thing while creating a deduction rule is to give the negative. For bonus trigger, you don't have to give the negative, but make sure you have to give the pay code. Without pay code, the system is not going to get generated. So that is all, friends, for this particular day 7 tutorial. I hope you enjoyed this session. If you have any questions, comments, or clarification, please put that down in the comment section. And do share this video with your friends who are interested in learning Kronos. And I will see you soon next time with day number 8, where we're going to learn another topic. And I'm going to come back with that tutorial pretty soon. Thank you so much for watching till the end.